When Dark Side of the Ring released its episode listing for season 6, and I saw Daphne's name included on there, we know her as Daphne. Her real name is Shannon Spruill. When I saw that, I knew this was going to be the heaviest episode of the entire season and the most depressing because her story is a really sad one. Here's a woman who still had so much to offer, who felt it was necessary to take her own life at just 46 years old, even though she had plenty of friends and family members who would be the first to tell you what a kind, generous person she was, the kind of person that you would want to be around and have in your life. That someone like that could do what she did is very depressing. This was only a year after Hana Kimura took her life, and that was a big story at the time. And so here we are again with somebody who felt like there was no other option but for them to do what they ended up doing. And if you're someone who's contemplated suicide before, or you know somebody who has taken their own life, and I'll bet some of you do, unfortunately, this may not be the best episode for you, but I do think it's important to tell her story and for them to let people know who Daffney was, because there are people who may not know. And what she went through, not only with her bipolar disorder, but her injuries and the way that she was treated, especially during her time in TNA, people should know. And I wasn't sure how this was going to come off, but I thought the producers handled her story very respectfully, even ending it on a positive note, as positive a note as you can end an episode like this on. It's still obviously a very sad story, but really showing at the very end the kind of person that she was. I thought it was very powerful stuff. They interviewed Daphne's father and brother for this, as well as several of her friends and coworkers from wrestling, Crowbar, Devon Storm from WCW. Jamie Lynn Senegal and Daphne, they were not related by blood, but Senegal refers to Daphne as her mom because Daphne mentored her and claimed her as basically her adopted daughter not long before she passed away. Senegal tweeted that she refused to take part in the episode and she refused to watch it. I guess because she was worried how Daphne might be portrayed in it. Daphne was portrayed fine, so she had nothing to worry about as far as that goes. How Daphne got into wrestling was she wanted to be an actress, and she had done a few movies. She was a child actress, and her agent asked her if she wanted to audition for the role of David Flair's stalker in WCW. And all she was told was, just go out there and act crazy. And so she did. She did such a good job that it turned into a recurring role, and it led to her making wrestling her full-time career. This is what she wanted to do. Crowbar said Daphne stood out because of her goth look at a time when a lot of the other women on TV looked like Barbie dolls. I wasn't watching much of WCW by the time she came in. That was during the Russo era there, but I was aware of the stuff that she was doing with David Flair. I know she even had, like a 2-week run as Cruiserweight champion. One of the few matches Miss Elizabeth ever wrestled in her career came against Daphne in WCW. It wasn't very long. It only lasted 30 or 40 seconds, but that's something of a trivia note because Liz did not wrestle a whole lot in her career. But Daphne had that piercing scream. My God, this woman could break glass with that scream. That's why they called her the Scream Queen. The character and the scream, it was based off the character Juliette Lewis played in the movie Natural Born Killers. And she's also cited the Harley Quinn character as an inspiration for it. A month before WCW closed its doors and got sold to WWE, they cut her. And she wanted to stay in wrestling, so she trained at the school that Dusty Rhodes was running at the time for his Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling promotion. And then in 2003, she was offered a developmental deal by WWE. And she got sent to OVW, and she was managing a young Aaron Stevens, who would later go on to become Damian Sandow. So she was signed in July. By December, they released her. And at that point, she was going to go back to acting, and she even sold her boots to Mickie James, who she was rooming with at the time. After that is where things started to take a turn. She had a 3-month period where she couldn't sleep for more than an hour a night. She developed a stutter. She called her father and told him, look, something's wrong. And her dad said that's when she first started thinking things would be better if maybe she just wasn't around anymore. So that's also when she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which is characterized by extreme mood swings where you can go from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows and just become depressed. Now, everyone goes through mood swings in their life. I mean, that's not what this is. This is a lot more severe. It's a lot more intense. And it can lead to people having suicidal thoughts. Her best friend, Amanda, was interviewed. She's also a wrestler, and she also suffers from bipolar. And she says there are drugs that you can take, but the side effects are horrible. But Daffney couldn't stay away from wrestling. She worked indies for a long time, including Shimmer. We heard from her ex-boyfriend, Caleb Conley, who's been wrestling for probably 20 years now. They dated for 4 years, and they met when they were in the business, but her bipolar disorder was always front and center in their relationship. So things would be great 1 minute, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, her mood would change, and she would have a short fuse. So ultimately, it led to the end of their relationship, but you could hear the pain in his voice and how much he cared about her. Obviously, they stayed friendly. But, you know, they spent 4 years together, and it was just clear it was not going to work out. Fast forward to 2008, and she gets a shot with TNA Wrestling. Now, she had made a few appearances for TNA in the past years ago, but she was paired up with Shark Boy at one point. She was Shark Girl. So she did some stuff like that, but it was in 2008 when she really got her shot as the Governor, which was a parody of Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin was the governor of Alaska at the time. She was John McCain's running mate in the presidential election. The woman was a walking meme machine. She was a gold mine for comedians. My God. And they wanted her to play Sarah Palin on TV. Like, this is fucking Saturday Night Live or something. And so she did. And she did such a good job, a lot of people had no idea that Daffney was the one playing her. So after that, she was back to being Daffney, because that was always going to have a short shelf life. And the election was over. And so she ends up working with Stevie Richards. And then we get Mick Foley here in the episode. Mick was a part of this. He said that he loved Daffney. A lot of people love Daffney. But on commentary, I remember they would refer to her as being zombie hot. That was one of her, I don't know if it was a nickname, but it was like a tagline. She's zombie hot. She even had a shirt in her Pro Wrestling Tee store that said zombie hot. She just had this girl next door vibe going on. Like if the girl next door was goth and had tattoos all over her body. Her segments on Impact, the quarter hour ratings were consistently far higher than they had any right to be, given the level of push that she was getting. I mean, it wasn't like she was pushed as a top star. And the thought was, again, girl next door type vibe. Maybe she was someone who was attainable in the eyes of the fans in a way that all the Barbie doll looking girls were not. All the ones who look like America's Next Top Model. But Daffney, I mean, this is a girl that I could get with, right? That's sort of the idea that goes through people's heads, even though, I'm sure the answer is no. But she had a certain appeal that kept people tuned into her segments, and they consistently did very well. People loved Daffney, but Foley loved her so much, he wanted her to be part of a story they were doing at the time with himself and the Monster Abyss. Foley and Abyss, they were scheduled to have a Monsters Ball match at Bound for Glory. This was in 2009. And he said Daffney was always up for anything and she was ready to do whatever was asked of her. What he didn't know was that the Monsters Ball match would be the beginning of the end for Daffney. This is the part of the story that makes me very angry. And this goes all the way back to the early days of the Sound Off, in a segment that I did on TNA's treatment or mistreatment, as it were, of the knockouts. Daffney being one of them. Now, times have changed, and TNA has changed, and it's under totally different management now. But women's wrestling now is far more prominent than it was back then, at least in this country. Even though the knockouts were really leading the charge, WWE wasn't doing jack shit with their women compared to what TNA was doing with the knockouts. Gail Kim, Awesome Kong, they were the two who really led the charge with their feud. They had some great matches together, great feud. And Dixie Carter admitted that the knockouts were consistently doing the highest rated segments on their shows. But then Gail Kim left in 2008. Why would she leave and go back to WWE when they fumbled the ball with her so badly the first time? Because TNA didn't want to pay her. Even though she was one of their biggest stars, when her contract came up for renewal, they offered her something like $35,000 to re-sign with the company. Now you factor in road expenses, and she would be making nothing. So she left to go back to WWE for a few years, and that didn't turn out any better for her than her first run did there. Taylor Wilde. Remember Taylor Wilde? She was a former TNA Knockouts champion. She got paid so little, she needed a second job working at a mall at a sunglass hut to make minimum wage. And then one day a customer said to her, "Hey, wait, aren't you the TNA Knockouts champion?" She was the champion at the time. She quit her job right there on the spot that day. It was so embarrassing for her. This is a company that was backed by the Carter family. Dixie's father was bankrolling the entire thing. He worked as an energy executive for Panda Energy. They aired on Spike TV, which was and is one of the bigger cable stations out there. They were hardly some starving indie promotion. And it wasn't just the women. I mean, to be fair, there were plenty of other stories about guys getting hurt in the ring and trying to rehab injuries instead of getting surgery, even when they really needed surgery, because they knew that they would be on the hook for those costs. Shawn Hernandez, he had neck surgery, and the company fronted him the money for it, but then they garnished a certain amount of his wages each paycheck after that for a long time because he had to pay them back. Ron Killings, R-Truth, left TNA for that very reason. He got hurt. Not in TNA's ring, but they booked him on the show where he did get hurt, and they took a percentage of whatever he got for the booking. He hurt his knee, he had surgery, and then they wanted him to pay it back in full. There were plenty of stories like that, even going back as far as 2003. Yet they could afford to pay Johnny Fairplay from Survivor $300,000 for 40 minutes worth of work that he gave them when you add up all of his appearances. And I still have no fucking idea what he actually did for them. And they gave him health insurance too. Meanwhile, they have a world champion working at Sunglass Hut just to be able to pay her bills. But I digress. We come back to Daffney. Daffney had been involved in Monsters Ball matches before, that same year, in fact. She beat Taylor Wilde and won at Sacrifice. And then she teamed with Raven and won at Slammiversary, so she was no stranger to these types of matches. But on this night, at Bound for Glory, it was Mick Foley against Abyss. Daffney is on the ropes, and she gets chokeslammed off the ropes by Abyss through a table with barbed wire on top of it that they made into like a bridge from the ring apron to the guardrail. She goes through it, and she smacks her head hard on the floor. And Foley says they did want her to play a role in the match, and that she was game to do it. But we also have Daffney's friend Lexi in the episode, who says Shannon called her that day and told her, "They want to throw me through this table with thumbtacks and barbed wire and all this stuff." And she said Shannon told her, "I don't know if I feel comfortable doing this." But of course she did it because she wanted to be a team player. But if she felt uncomfortable, she should have said something. Maybe she did. Maybe she did, and they talked her into doing it. Who knows? We'll never know. The stories at the time were that Terry Taylor and Vince Russo were the ones who pushed her to do it because they felt it was needed for the show. But it's like the Owen Hart thing. Owen's family says he wasn't comfortable going up and doing the Blue Blazer entrance. But he was threatened that if he didn't do it, he would be out of a job. And it's hard for me to believe that they would just fire someone like Owen Hart for not wanting to do a dumb entrance, but maybe they would have. Or maybe he thought they would have. And if he didn't want to lose his job or be in breach of his contract, we told him to do something, he said, "No, you're in breach." Then I can see where he would have felt like, you know what? Okay, let's just do it and get it over with. Like, unless you're in that position, you can't really know what someone is thinking in that moment. It's like, oh, well, why don't they just say no? You know what? It's not always that cut and dry. In hindsight, I wish she would have said no, but she didn't. And she suffered a very bad concussion. She had no memory of what happened after. She also broke her arm. We got footage from backstage. I don't know if that was actual footage of the aftermath, or if that was some other footage from an angle they used here. I think it was from that night. And you see Daffney in the back. She's in pain, and Foley is with her after they load her into the back of the ambulance. The worst part about the whole thing, aside from Daffney getting hurt, is that she went through all of that and their cameras missed the fucking shot. You see Abyss chokeslam her off, and you hear the crash, but you don't actually see her take the bump. And Spike wouldn't let them air the spot on Impact because they had a policy at the time of not showing any male-on-female violence. So unless you were in the building, you didn't even see the spot. She had no business being back in the ring as quickly as she was. But a few months later, she was back. And then she got hurt again. And if the table bump wasn't the beginning of the end for her, then this match was. She had a match with a wrestler named Miss Betsy. Or Rosie Lotta Love is the name that she used after TNA signed her. Because see, Lotta Love, because she was a big girl, hence the name. There was a lot to love. Haha. So years later, WWE signed her. She lost like 130 pounds. She entered the Mae Young Classic. She was under the name Sage Beckett. She lost to Bianca Belair. And then she was let go 9 months later. Never heard from again. Not even in the business anymore. Rosie came out of the Team 3D Academy. She was trained by Bully Ray and Devon and was recommended for a tryout by Bubba Ray Dudley. And she proceeded to nearly kill Daffney in what was her tryout match because she was fucking terrible and didn't know what the fuck she was doing. So naturally, TNA signed her to a contract. And I don't even think she lasted a month. She had like 2 or 3 matches and they realized how bad she was and they got rid of her. That's 2 different companies that signed her, only to let her go shortly thereafter. That should tell you everything you need to know about her. But in the match with Daffney, and they showed highlights here of what happened, she sat down on her and crushed Daffney's sternum. She gave her another grade 2 concussion. She gave her a stinger on top of everything else. Evidently, in TNA back then, that qualified you for a job. Now, in the episode, they have footage from a shoot interview that Daffney did in 2013. Talking about filing a workers' compensation claim against TNA as a way to try to prove in a court of law that wrestlers were not independent contractors, they were employees. But they didn't get into a lot of the nuts and bolts of this. What happened is TNA refused to pay for her medical bills after the chokeslam bump at Bound for Glory. She had to go to the emergency room. She racked up bills. They totaled over $26,000. She alleges that TNA made a $600 payment and that was it. When she got hit with a letter requesting payment for the remaining money, she claimed that Terry Taylor, who worked in talent relations at the time for TNA, told her that the company would pay the remainder, only they didn't, which led to even more letters that she needed to pay this money. You got to pay this money. This is your responsibility. And in one of those letters, they cited that TNA had declined to pay the balance because they deemed Shannon an independent contractor, despite what Terry Taylor had told her. That's why she was contesting the whole independent contractor classification in the first place, because TNA was citing it to the insurance as a way to refuse paying her bills. And in her lawsuit, she also alleged that the company's lawyer in Texas, which is where Panda Energy was based, their parent company, had advised TNA to delay the payment as a way to try to settle it for a smaller amount. Just keep delaying it. Now, Daffney's team claimed to have proof of this through emails that were forwarded by Terry Taylor to Shannon. And her team even had the attorney, the Texas attorney, named as a witness and had him deposed in her case. Now, TNA did eventually, finally, settle the claim for around $8,000, but only after this woman was hounded for over a year by creditors who were demanding that she pay these bills. So she ended up settling the lawsuit before it even went to trial because had the courts ruled in her favor and deemed that she was an employee and not an independent contractor, I mean, it would have been the biggest story in wrestling. It would have sent shockwaves through not only TNA, but the entire industry. You know that WWE was watching that case just as closely as TNA was because it affected them just as much. And they would have done the same thing. Let's settle this shit as quickly and as quietly as possible because if we don't, it's going to open up a whole can of worms that we're not going to be able to close. Now, I never knew what the settlement was because it was confidential. She did get some money. How much money, I don't know. But in the episode, Caleb Conley says as part of that settlement, TNA gave her 1,000 of her action figures, which he says is a crock of shit. So, like, here's this woman who had a near-death experience for your company, and the best that you can do And again, I don't know how much money was exchanged, but the best you can do is, hey, why don't you take this and go make your own money hawking them at indie shows and conventions? Like, that's insane. That is insane to me. But now, at this point, she knows she can't wrestle anymore. It's been taken away from her, and she has to figure out what to do next with her life. She's still a young person at that point, so she did signings and appearances, and she worked with Shine, the promotion down in Florida. She told her family she wanted her brain to be donated to be studied for CTE after her death. She ended up self-medicating. She would mix that with alcohol, and that's not a good combination. And she was in a terrible car accident where her car hydroplaned and flipped upside down in 3 feet of water. So she had neck fusion surgery years later because she was dealing with pain that was just so bad, even with the meds, she just couldn't think straight. But after that car accident, she was sent to rehab. The court ordered her to rehab. The night before she was to have checked into rehab, she thought about suicide. But she made a pact with her friend that if the thought ever crossed her mind, she would call her friend to let her know, and that's what she did. Now, she had issues with her meds. They were causing her to gain weight. She didn't look the same anymore. She would read some of the horrible comments people would make online about her appearance. That didn't help her mental state. Then COVID shut everything down in 2020, and she felt even more isolated, which is something, everybody went through that. It's not anything that's unique just to pro wrestlers. Everybody during the COVID shutdowns went through something similar, where you felt like you were just isolated from friends or family or from the rest of the world. But in the case of someone like Scott Hall, I remember Kevin Nash telling this story, it was even worse for someone like Scott and all of his vices and demons to be isolated away from everybody and stuck at home by himself. And he feels that was part of what did Scott Hall in there at the end. That certainly didn't do him any favors. So it wasn't doing her any favors either. And then we get to September 1st, 2021. I was getting ready to go live on YouTube as soon as Dynamite ended when I saw what was going on. It was the first thing I talked about after I went live because I was still kind of, flustered by what I had just seen. Shannon went live on Instagram, and all of her friends got the notification on their phones, and they were troubled by what they saw. So was I. And she's crying. She had a gun in her hand. She was talking about not wanting to be a burden on her friends, talking about how alone she felt. Do you not understand that I'm all alone? She said the thing with CTE and concussions is that can only really be diagnosed after you're dead. So I don't want to do anything to hurt my brain. I want it to be studied. I want the future generations to know, don't do stupid shit like me. Just remember, my brain goes to Boston, straight to Boston. Boston is where the Concussion Legacy Institute is located. It's run by Chris Nowinski. Her friends all start freaking out. They're trying to get in touch with her. She's not answering her phone. Her friend Lexi logs on, and when she does, Shannon notices and messages her, apologizing and saying she was going to break her promise, which was heartbreaking. That was the promise that if she ever had any thoughts of suicide, she would reach out and let her know. Crowbar tried calling her over and over again, kept getting messages saying her voice mailbox was full. Foley tried calling her, nothing. And then the screen went black. Now, from the TMZ article at the time, this is what TMZ reported. Police were called for a welfare check. According to the police report, they were met by Daphne's mom, Jean. They knocked at the door, but there was no answer, so they left without trying to gain entry. They came back a second time a few hours later, and this time they saw Daphne's car parked near the apartment. A maintenance man gave cops a key, but it didn't unlock the deadbolt, so the fire department was called, and they broke open the door, and they found Daphne's body on her bed with a gunshot wound to her chest and a gun within reach. She shot herself in the chest to protect her brain. It's like Dave Durson. He played in the NFL for the Bears. This was years before Daphne. Same thing. He shot himself in the chest because he wanted his brain to be tested, and they found that he had CTE. It's just so incredibly sad that here you have this woman who's saying, I'm all alone, I have nobody, don't you understand that? At the same time, all of these people are rushing to call her and text her that she's not alone, and she has a lot of people who love her and care about her. I don't know if it was her bipolar. I don't know if it was CTE. Whatever it was, she genuinely felt that she was all alone. And it's just awful. Her family did donate her brain to Boston. They did find evidence of CTE. They didn't say how much. It would have been sad enough to end the episode like that. I'm glad they included the story, though, of her and Vicky Lyons. So Mick Foley said that he was watching an episode one night of Forensic Files. And the episode was about this girl who was run over by a car. And he Googled the girl's name just to see what comes up. And the first thing that came up in his Google search was Vicky Lyons having a wrestling match with Daffney. And Michael Bukikio, the owner of highspots.com, has also told this story. He was very close with Daffney. When Vicky Lyons was 4 years old, she was run over by a pickup truck that backed over her while she was playing outside. And she survived, but it left her disabled. She had damage to her skull, one of her eyes. They said she would never be able to lead a normal life. And she has since passed away. She died of a brain aneurysm. I think she was in her mid-30s. But before that, she had taken an interest in becoming a pro wrestler. And she went to wrestling school. She trained for 5 years. And it was during that time that she became friends with Daffney. It was Daffney's goal to let this girl live her dream and have a pro wrestling match. The one and only match that she ever had. And it happened in 2008. So this was even before all the awful stuff that happened to her in TNA. But this is a great example of the kind of human being that Daffney was. They had a match. Daffney put her over. Of course she did. I mean, can you imagine? After all that, they get to the building and Daffney's like, creative control, brother. But she put this girl over and she let her live her dream. And the match is on YouTube still if you want to watch it. But that's who Daffney was. They ended the episode on a high note with that story. It was the most powerful episode they've done all season and still very fresh. I mean, again, it hasn't even been 5 years yet. So it felt a little bit different because you have all these other episodes on The Sheik and Ludwig Borga and Muhammad Hassan and all these different things that were 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. This all still feels very fresh. And it was just a very sad end for someone who did not deserve to go out the way that she did. And it's a good opportunity here to just let people know who may be listening to this that if you are in a dark place, suicide is never the answer. Because when you make that decision, there is no going back. There is no second chance. You don't respawn. It's not how it works. And there are other people, whether you believe it or not, who do care about you and who do want to help you. So pick up the phone and dial 988. That's the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. They're online as well, but it's just 3 digits. Just talk to someone. Sometimes that's all it takes.